Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. It's such an honor to be with you. It's such a delight to be in a room full of union leaders and activists. I spend most of my time with academics, and I'm the shop steward for my department. I am in a union, but we like to call ourselves faculty associations. And we were having a fight recently about a recent strike that took place on our campus at York University. You might have heard about it. QP 3903 went on strike and won a historic agreement for precarious workers on our campus. And UFA, the faculty association there, was very strongly in support of that strike. But not all our members really agree. And the shop steward from economics, we were having a fight on our email list, and she said, surely we all realize we're academics first and unionists second. And I said, speak for yourself, sister. I'm a unionist first, no matter what. And it's just great to be home with other unionists. This is also the first time I've gotten to speak at a union convention without having to line up at the mic first. So that's great. Thanks for letting me jump the queue. And wow, what an embarrassment of riches on your program. I mean, all of the speakers so far have been great. I was worried about having to speak, after Stephen Lewis. I was so relieved that didn't happen to me. But then I get Linda Silas ahead of me. That's crazy. So anyway, I'm gonna try to do my best for you and talk about how do we get more workers into unions and how law can help us do that. Let me first start by saying that I have a confession to make. I love union conventions. I'm a convention nerd. It's a bit embarrassing. I always cry at the year-end review videos. I love a good floor fight, and I love seeing people line up at the mics. I love it when thousands of dollars are raised for striking local in a matter of minutes. I love it when someone gets up to speak at the mic for the first time. It takes all their courage, and afterwards a sister goes over to her and hugs her, as I just saw over there. That is what our labor movement is about, and that is why we want more people in this movement. And I can say that going to union convention is something that changed my life. I grew up in a staunch union family in New Brunswick. My mother was a union nurse. My dad was a union pipe fitter. But this was a union family, but they didn't have the opportunity to be involved in the labor movement in this way. So it was only when I became a union member myself as a university worker, when I walked into a convention hall at QP Ontario in 1993, that I saw what the labor movement was really all about. And it really did change my life. When I saw the thousands of ordinary people, all from different walks of life, talking about their stories passionately, eloquently, with great knowledge about the issues that we face in our workplaces, in our community, when I saw the power of making democratic decisions together, I knew that this was a movement that I would be part of for the rest of my life, and that I devote any talent or skill that I had to making it more powerful. And for all of its warts and limits, convention, we have to acknowledge convention is a practice of mass direct democracy in a society where our voice is usually delegated to others, is delegated to politicians who may or may not speak on our behalf, right? This is a space, a convention, where we get to see what our society could really be like if we were serious about deep democracy, and it's another reason why I want more people in our movement. I also want to say, as many other people have said, I love the theme of this year's convention, Dream No Little Dreams. It comes from the title of the biography of CCF Premier of Saskatchewan, the father of Medicare, Tommy Douglas. And really, when you think about it, so much of the attack on workers, on our movements over the past 30 years, our collective agreements, our social programs, our democratic institutions, it's also been an attack on our dreams, on the dreams of previous generations, on our very ability to dream. The powerful do not want us to dream. They want us to lower our expectations. When Margaret Thatcher told us there is no alternative to unfettered free markets, what she was really telling us, what she was telling workers, don't bother dreaming. To all of those who followed in her footsteps and implemented the policies that she is famous for, have repeated that same mantra, there's no alternative, and they're hoping to beat our dreams out of us. And you know what? There's also been some people in our ranks over the years, in the ranks of the labor movement, who have also counseled workers to think small, to think just about the here and now. Just think about the next wage increase, the reasonable, gradual improvement. Samuel Gompers, who was a cigar maker who for 40 years was the president of the other AFL, the American Federation of Labor, he was nothing if not a pragmatist. One of the reasons that he disliked socialists so much was because they were always going on about revolution and visions of society after capitalism, and he thought this was just a distracting fantasy. For him, he said, the trade unions, pure and simple, are the natural organizations of the wage worker to secure their present material and practical improvement, not to imagine a society constructed from rainbow materials. I think that's wrong. I think that unions are for imagining a new society. The labor movement is united by a collective dream, a dream of justice, of dignity, and of equality. And our labor movement in Canada has always put things on the agenda that at the time appeared beyond the realm of the possible. Putting an end to child labor was once a dream, but our labor movement did that. The 8-hour day and the 40-hour work week was once a dream, but our labor movement did that. Employers' legal obligation to recognize and bargain with workers' freely chosen representatives was once a dream, but our labor movement did that. Universal health care as a human right was once a dream, but our labor movement did that. And if we want our society to keep making progress, we need to keep reaching beyond what seems possible too. So, as Brad said, I was asked to talk to you about the growing problem of inequality, about how unions are the best solution we have for reversing that inequality, and therefore how to reform our labor laws so that we might get more workers into unions. So I'm going to start by showing you a few pictures just to make the case for the first 2 points, and then maybe get you dreaming about some of the kinds of labor law that would really help more workers get into unions and make those unions more powerful. Okay, so, you've seen this graph probably about 1 million times. This is for Canada, right? Here's one reason that the powerful don't want us dreaming about making unionization easier. It's because when the rate of unionization goes down, the share of wealth going to the top, in this case, the top 10%, goes up. All of the research, whether it's by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Parkland Institute, or even those, radical left-wing organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the OECD, right? All of that research shows the same thing. There is a very clear connection between rising inequality and the declining rate of unionization. So this graph shows you one measure of inequality, right? The share of national income going to the top 10%, and you can see that it diverges with the rate of unionization. In your issue primer, you have another graph that shows you the relationship between unionization and another measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, which measures the spread between the wealthiest and the poorest. And again, it's very clear, when unionization goes down, the spread between the wealthiest and the poorest gets wider, and this is happening in every province in Canada where unionization is going down. So it's not just an Alberta problem, even though you might be in the lead. Now, this graph might not seem so dramatic, so let's look at another one with the same measure for the United States. Right? We see even more dramatic decline in unionization, which is the blue line, and then the red line, the share of national income going to the top 10%, climbing at unbelievable rates. Now, partly why Canada isn't in such a difficult state is because, unions aren't the only factor in creating equality, right? There are other safeguards that the labor movement has fought for that are still having their effect, right? Good public services, a strong social safety net that helps people from falling through the cracks, but of course, as we know, the powers that be are coming to get those too. You know, in the US, their public services are so much weaker, and so we see a much more dramatic effect of the decline of unionization. And, you know, all of this shows us that, you know, what is very clear, that unions redistribute wealth. They make sure that more of the wealth that we collectively create goes to workers, whether through wages or public services, rather than CEOs, shareholders, or offshore banks. So here's a way we can also see clearly how unions put more income into workers' hands. Right? When we compare union and non-union workers' wages, unions clearly make sure that workers take home more of the wealth they create. Right? That union advantage also gets larger for workers who are more marginalized or discriminated against in the labor market. And you can see that's why women workers, the union advantage for women workers is so much greater. It's $7 an hour, higher than the average. Well, let's look at some more ways in which unions generate equality. Let's look at gender pay equity. You know, this is actually a shocking graph to me, right? I mean, we know that the fight for gender pay equity is not won, right? But what this tells us, even where we have pay equity legislation, as we do in Ontario, that one of the most important factors that determines whether or not women's work is valued as much as men's work is whether they have a union. Right? It's absolutely true in a province like Alberta, which doesn't have pay equity legislation, I'm sure you know. Right? You have equal pay for doing the same work, but not equal pay for different work, but of equal value, which is a really hugely important thing. I'll talk about that after. But in Ontario too, right, the gender pay gap is still there, even though we have the most progressive pay equity legislation in the country. It applies both to public and private sectors. It's a proactive system that requires the employers to develop a pay equity plan rather than let workers complain about gender pay equity. Right? Even there, the law's not enough. Even there's a differential between non-union and union women experience of the gender pay gap. Right? Why is this? Because the law itself is not enough. Right? Workers need unions to give them the power to ensure that employers live up to their legal obligations. All right, so all this is well and good, but doesn't the union advantage come at a cost? You know, right-wingers say. Doesn't it mean that in order for unionized workers to have higher wages and decent benefits that other workers or taxpayers have to do without, or the poor? Doesn't the union advantage just show that unions create inequality? No, absolutely not. These people are wrong. If we broaden our view, we can see very clearly that unions are one of the most important anti-poverty strategies around. And in fact, the more widespread unions are, the bigger their anti-poverty impact. And isn't this just common sense? Right? At the level of the workplace, unions transform bad jobs into good ones. They take jobs that used to be at the bottom of the barrel, pay bottom of the barrel wages, used to be radically unsafe, that only the most desperate people would take, and they transform them into good jobs that allow for dignity, economic security, and inclusion in the rest of society. They reduce the spread between the highest and the lowest paid in any given workplace because they work to bring up the lowest paid, who are discriminated against, often because they are seen to be doing low status or unimportant jobs. At the level of an industry, the higher the union presence, the more union wages and conditions spill over to non-union workplaces, whether it's because employers have to, compete to keep workers in their workplaces, or because they want to keep the union out, right? So they have to match the union wage and benefits, and we see that in Ontario, in the town that I live in now, Hamilton. Stelco and Dofasco had long had this dynamic where Dofasco workers, in some ways, only had the wages and benefits that they did because there was a union down the street at Stelco. We won't talk about what's going on there now. So we know that collective bargaining and the spread of collective bargaining, the presence of unions in an economy is an anti-poverty measure, right? So any claim that unionized workers are taking from non-union workers is, I'll quote the very eloquent Alex Himmelfarb, it's bullshit. It's just bullshit. I'm not running for election, I can say that. But it's more than that. It's not just bullshit. It's a bait and switch, right? This cartoon shows us that it's actually, that argument, a calculated distraction from what's really going on, who it is in our economy that is really taking advantage of workers, not paying their fair share, and generating inequality. And sisters and brothers, we're not falling for it, are we? We're not going to fall for this. We're not going to fall for it. Right? The real source of inequality in this country are corporations, the wealthy individuals who lead them, and the governments that enable them. So I could go on and talk to you, show you a million other graphs, and they would all show you the same thing, that unions are one of the most important and effective vehicles for economic and social equality that human beings have ever created. And clearly, for this equality to spread, for us to reverse the damage done in our communities, we need more workers to be in unions, and we need those unions to have real power. So this brings us to the question of law. Now, I'll just say that law is not the source of workers' power. The source of workers' power is collective action. But the law shapes how we can act collectively, so we can't ignore it. And if we want to change the law, we also have to think about how we engage in collective action to transform it. So let me just put that on the table. So what kind of labor law would make it more possible for workers to gain access to unions, and once they get into unions, for those unions to be more powerful and effective vehicles for workers' interests? So I want to focus on three areas. I want to talk about rules around organizing and certifying bargaining units and how they relate to each other. I want to talk about rules that govern collective bargaining and the content of our collective agreements and our working conditions. And I want to talk about rules around the use of the strike. Okay, so we'll have the labor law bullseye here. So our current labor law, which does give workers power if they can get access to it, right? It does give workers some power, right? Employers can't decide they don't want to talk to the union when it's certified. They can't decide which particular union they're going to talk to. That's up to us, right? They have to bargain in good faith. They have to collect dues on behalf of the union and remit them to us. They can't just do whatever they want once the collective agreement's in place. When the bargaining relationship is in place, they have to act reasonably and consistently with the spirit of the collective agreement, right? They have to share power with workers, right? That's an enormous reason why we need more unionization, right? And of course, in our country, unionization means access to the right to strike, to improve your terms and conditions of work. But I think we all know that there are hundreds, thousands of workers who want to be in unions who can't get into them. That the hurdles for unionization are significant. That the certification process makes it very difficult for instance, workers at a Tim Hortons to get a certified bargaining unit that's going to have any bargaining power. We've seen that all across the country, even when workers have been able to organize, like at Walmart and Jonquière, the employer shuts down that facility. The structure of employers and the structure of our certification system is out of sync. So what can we do to help get more workers into unions? Well, the first thing, I think, which is a no-brainer, it's on your agenda, it has to be one of the first things that you do, is to get the restoration of card check certification. When workers sign a union card, that should be enough of a test to determine their desire to unionize. You know, we're not children. You know, when we sign a union card, we sign our name, we mean it. And you know what? One time it was. In 1977, all Canadian jurisdictions had card check certification. Right? Now only 4 provinces have it. Right? And the federal government just got rid of it with Bill C-525. What a shame. It is a shame, brothers and sisters. And what is the best litmus test for the effectiveness of card check certification? Employers and their right-wing allies hate it. They want to get rid of it. They have fought tooth and nail over the last 30 years to get rid of card check because they know what the research shows, that the win rates of certification drives drop by 10 to 20% when workers have to go through the second step of a mandatory vote. Right? Employers, they prefer a mandatory vote certification system, not because it's more democratic, but because it gives them more time to pressure, cajole, coerce, bribe, or intimidate workers out of their free choice to unionize. So we know card check would make an enormous difference. So would remedial or automatic certification, right? Automatic certification of a bargaining unit by the labor board when the employer's actions have so poisoned the organizing drive that workers' true intentions can't be determined. Do you know that Alberta is one of only 3 Canadian provinces that don't have automatic remedial certification? And to me, this strikes me as so deeply unfair. Right? It rewards employers who engage in unfair labor practices to avoid unions. And we can't permit that, brothers and sisters. We cannot permit employers to trump our democratic right to choose a union. To me, these first 2 things seem like no-brainers and not radical dreams in the least. Okay, so let's say we get this. Is this enough? We get more workers into unions because we make the hurdles for showing we want to be in unions less, and we have automatic certification to allow for workers to, who might otherwise have wanted a union, but the employer interfered with their choice. Is it enough of a change to empower workers once they get into unions? I'm going to argue that no, that's only the first step. That there's also the question of whether or not a union is going to have any bargaining power. And a major problem in Canada is that our labor laws systematically produce fragmented bargaining units. Probably in our country, along with the United States and the UK, we have the most fragmented labor relations system in the industrialized world. Our labor relations boards, when they decide who's going to be in a bargaining unit together, they use this notion called community of interest, right? They decide what workers have enough in common that they can function together as a bargaining unit. And one of the things that they use as their guide is the kind of jobs that people do. Are they similar enough to each other? But, those are decisions that are made by employers, right? Employers decide the division of labor in our workplaces. They decide who does what. And you can be assured that workers do not organize the workplace with a view of maximizing workers' common identification and solidarity. In fact, quite the opposite. Right? So when labor boards take the employer's decisions as natural or given as the basis for organizing workers' organizations, they build into it all kinds of divisions and fragmentations. Right? Many of the bargaining units that end up getting certified then, even if they're able to get past that first hurdle, don't actually have enough bargaining power on their own. That's why we need sectoral forms of bargaining. We need sectoral bargaining for unionized workers, right? Now, the thing is, we don't actually have to look far beyond our own labor movement to see that sectoral bargaining works, right? We don't have to look to Sweden, where they have industry-wide bargaining and throughout the economy, and they have one of the lowest poverty rates in the world, and where retail workers make $20 an hour, thank you very much. We don't have to look to Sweden. We can look at our own history, where we ourselves have done sectoral bargaining, right? Pattern bargaining and master contracts used to be the norm in North American manufacturing. right? In the public sector, even today, there are provincial tables in education and healthcare, right? In the private sector, especially in the United States, hotel workers and janitors have been organizing to create city-wide pattern agreements that they hold city-based employers to, right? All the hotels in a particular place. But the reality is that, except for the public sector, most of these sectoral bargaining structures are in some ways voluntary, quote unquote, right? It's done through organizing and getting an employer to agree to participate in a pattern or a sectoral bargaining arrangement. But why should that be? If a majority of unionized workers in a sector vote to create a sectoral bargaining table, why should the law not recognize that as something employers must bargain with, just as they must when a particular group in a workplace decides to unionize? There's no reason, brothers and sisters. But let's get a little more crazy. Let's dream a little more dreams. What about sectoral bargaining for all workplaces, whether or not they're unionized, right? What about a system that actually extends the deal that is negotiated by unions at a sectoral table to all workplaces in that sector, right? That is the system that they have in France, brothers and sisters, since the 1950s, where all of the unions that have a minimum presence in a particular industry get to sit at an industry-wide table where bargaining is negotiated across the country, right? There are company tables as well for, we have that too in our system. But why should it not be that employers cannot be allowed to compete with each other on the basis of degrading workers' livelihoods and dignity, playing union and non-union workers off against each other? They should not. Okay, let's talk about bargaining, right? First contract arbitration, right? It is essential. This is when an employer is the most resistant to a union. It's the most angry that it lost, right? And it's the most determined to try and get rid of the union, right? To prevent it from establishing a bargaining relationship, right? And without first contract arbitration, again, the law rewards a stubborn employer who is willing to do what it takes to trump workers' democratic choice, right? Protracted strikes over first contracts are reduced by over 50% when this legislation is in place, right? That on its own is enough of a reason. But what about what goes into our collective agreements? Right? If you look at our labor legislation, the labor laws are actually very thin on the things that have to go in every collective agreement, right? It's just the basic rules of engagement, right? That you have to have a recognition clause, you have to have a scope clause, you can't have strikes or lockouts while the collective agreement's in place, you have to have a dispute resolution mechanism, but everything else that goes into collective agreement is negotiated. It's a function of the bargaining power of a particular group of workers. But it's interesting to note that over time, we've actually come to the conclusion that there are some things that are so important as a basic right in the workplace that they shouldn't be left up to whether or not workers can muster enough bargaining power with respect to their particular employer, right? That's why we have human rights codes. That's why we have occupational health and safety laws that are read into our collective agreements. Why not more? Why should it not be, brothers and sisters, that every collective agreement in this country automatically has pay equity and employment equity language in it? Why not? Should we not say that there are some things that are so important that it shouldn't hinge on the ability of a particular group of workers to get their employer to agree? But what about this? What about all of those workers that still aren't in unions? What about the fact of minimum employment standards? I think that today, the labor movement has to take very seriously the need to fight to improve the legal minimum employment standards for all workers, whether they're unionized or not. We have a leading role to play in that struggle, right? The labor movement has to see the Employment Standards Act as every bit as important as the Labor Code or Labor Relations Act, and has to put as much energy into lifting the floor as it does into the rules around unionization and collective bargaining. For me, the first order of business has to be the establishment of this basic norm, that the legal minimum wage has to be a living wage and not a poverty wage. It has to be a wage that lets all workers meet the basic needs with dignity and social inclusion, whether they have a union or not. The second order of business on this front has to be a system of proactive inspections for employment standards enforcement. It is absurd, brothers and sisters, that we have a system that requires individual workers who do not have collective organizations backing them up to enforce their employment standards. It is ridiculous that they must come forward to make complaints about their employers violating the law when we know full well that employers are happy to take reprisals against workers who speak up. A proactive system of enforcement would take the onus off of individual workers and put it on the shoulders where it belongs, on the government, who should be enforcing their own laws. Okay, so now let's talk about strikes. It's very clear now, and I think we're all very excited about the recent Supreme Court decision, that the right to strike should be the default in our labor relations system, and that any exemptions from this, any use of essential worker designation is the exception, not the rule. And, you know, as the Supreme Court said in its historic decision in Saskatchewan Federation of Labor versus Saskatchewan, essential services designation must be minimally impairing. That is, carefully tailored so that rights are impaired no more than necessary. And I congratulate you, sisters and brothers, for taking the lead on turning back legislation that pushes back the encroachment on our essential right to strike. I congratulate you for turning back bills 45 and 46. It's an amazing victory. And we must do that. We must do more of that. But what about this? What about the fact that our definition of legal strike is actually quite narrow? Right now, the labor law ties the strike to collective bargaining for it to be legal. So-called workplace issues are artificially separated from the political or policy framework by which those workplace issues are fundamentally shaped. Right? Those of us who work in the public sector know this all too well, right? This separation between workplace and political issues is a fiction. There's always a ghost at the bargaining table. But we can't strike over provincial budget cuts, not legally anyway. We can't legally strike to challenge those policies that fundamentally harm us and our communities. When we do this, we risk, as you well know, we risk legal sanction and financial penalties that might fundamentally undermine our organizations. But it's not just in the public sector where this is a problem. Imagine where we might be today if we could have had a national strike against free trade in 1988 when 60% of the Canadian public voted for anti-free trade political parties but were completely ignored. What if we could do as French workers have done, engage in 3 strikes over the last 20 years to save their public pension systems? We have to acknowledge that the definition of a legal strike is designed to cut us off from our real political power, right? Our political power is in the ballot box, but it's also in our ability to withdraw our labor for political purposes. And I think that if we want to really transform the society, we need to re-embrace that notion of the strike. What about this last one? Protection of all workers' concerted activity, whether they're unionized or not. That's a bit more of a radical dream, right? But it's interesting. I think that the Supreme Court decision actually might open the door to this, right? Justice Rosalie Abella explained it when she was writing for the majority. Through a strike, workers come together to participate directly in the process of determining their wages, working conditions, and the rules that will govern their working lives. The ability to strike therefore allows workers, through collective action, to refuse to work under imposed terms and conditions. And this is an affirmation of the dignity and autonomy of employees in their working lives. So if the right to strike is a constitutional right that all workers have because it's the only way to redress the imbalance of power between themselves and their employers, and that it is a human right to refuse to work under imposed terms and conditions, then why should the right to strike only attach to workers who are in a certified union? Why should not workers, any combination of workers who are trying to pressure their employer to improve terms and conditions at work, be protected by law when they do that? You know, it's interesting. You know, we don't usually look to the United States for labor law models, but in this one area, the U.S. is superior to us. In their National Labor Relations Act, Section 7 actually protects all employees' right to engage in concerted activities for the purposes of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. It's employees, not unions. It says that and it's not just collective bargaining, it's any attempt at mutual aid and protection. It's this legislation that's actually spurring the really amazing wave of strikes and other actions in fast food in the United States, at Walmarts across the United States, where workers are not unionized, but they are challenging their employers directly, withdrawing their labor to improve their working lives. And, you know, and I think that the Supreme Court has opened the door to this kind of strike action in Canada as well. I certainly hope so. I've gone over my time, so I only have one slide left. Don't you hate those speakers at convention that go over their time? Okay. Okay. I'm going backwards. Okay. So dreaming is a radical act. And it's an obligation that we have to ourselves and to the next generation to keep dreaming. But is the stuff that I've said really dreaming in Technicolour? Right? You know, sometimes it's not enough to just have dreams. We actually need to think about how we generate the collective power to make those dreams a reality. If the labor movement's power lies in its numbers, how do we use those numbers effectively to get even the most modest changes like card check, not to mention the more ambitious ones like a right to strike for all workers? And whether we look at historical examples or contemporary examples, there's three elements that make legal breakthroughs possible. Three important ingredients that have to be there at the same time. Those are broad forms of solidarity, right, where both the demands being made would benefit the widest amount of people, and the people involved come from a broad cross-section of the community, precisely so that unions can't be isolated as somehow representing a special interest. The second thing is political mobilization that disrupts the status quo and puts elected officials in real fear of losing their power and makes them willing to pressure employers in order to accept legal reforms. And the third, and hopefully Bill C-51 is not implemented yet, when I say this, might get me in trouble, is economic disruption. you know, SFL versus Saskatchewan is not going to be worth the paper it's written on unless workers in this country begin to use their right to strike to disrupt what employers really care about, which is money. They don't care about us, brothers and sisters. They care about their profits. And the only way that we can disrupt the things that they care about is using our capacity to strike. Right? Striking makes resisting reform more costly than the reforms itself. So you can't have a massive change in the labor framework, the legal framework, without a combination of these three elements. Right? Let me give you two examples, one a historical one and another a contemporary one. During and immediately after the Second World War, we had these three conditions. We had a strike wave of massive proportions, even in the war industries. Did you know that in 1943, Canada was in a full-blown strike wave? In that year alone, 1/3 of unionized workers, that's 250,000 workers in 434 different strikes, were pressing the government to recognize their unions. Right? Between 1941 and 43, almost 500,000 workers went on strike in 1,100 different work stoppages. There was massive economic disruption in this country in the middle of the Second World War. What else was happening at that time? The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the predecessor to the NDP, was also on the rise. It was becoming a real threat to the federal liberals and conservative governments that ran many provinces. Right? It made it so that, you know, when the Ontario CCF almost won government, they came within 4 seats of winning government in 1943. Right? The political powers that be were quaking in their boots. And in that time, we also had a movement of broad solidarity where communities supported unions in the fight to entrench the legal rights to have our unions recognized, to entrench the right to collective bargaining. And it was the combination of these three pressures, not just politics, not just community support, not just striking, but all three together, that made it possible for the major breakthrough after the Second World War in our labor legislation. Today, we have similar things going on in the US, and the living wage and minimum wage fights across the United States also involve a clear connection between these three strategies. We have economic disruption of regular one-day walkouts to challenge poverty wages in the service sector. You have the mobilization of labor politically at the city and state levels, electing allies, mobilizing around ballot initiatives, such that Seattle and San Francisco have now both moved to implement a $15 minimum wage in their cities, and 21 states have increased or are increasing their state minimum wage this year alone. Right? And all of that is being generated by the broadest possible coalition that links union and non-union workers, worker centers, churches, political allies on an issue that will affect and improve the lives of a wide swath of the population and clearly takes the high moral ground. I ask you, are you on the brink of the conditions that might create openings like this? Dare the rest of us in Canada dream about what might happen in Alberta? Let me end then where I began, with the importance of dreaming. Tommy Douglas once said, "We should never be afraid or ashamed about dreams. The dreams won't all come true. We won't always make it. But where there is no vision, a people perish. Where people have no dreams and no hopes and aspirations, a life becomes dull and meaningless wilderness." But I know that you won't let that happen, sisters and brothers. I know that you are a labor movement that dreams big and fights hard for those dreams. You're the labor movement that fought the gainer strike. You're the labor movement whose nurses and hospital workers struck for what is right, whether it was legal or not. You are the labor movement that beat back racist anti-union strategies at places like Lakeside Packers. And you are the labor movement, are you? You're the labor movement that's going to elect the first NDP government in Alberta's history? And I know, you're going to be the labor movement in the lead of reversing the tide of anti-worker labor law in this country, and I'll be proud to be side by side with you in that fight. Thank you very much. Great.